You check the news one day and bam, the U.S. is talking about buying Greenland again. It's March 2025, and we're suddenly back to this idea that was making waves a few years ago when President Trump, he was pretty clear about wanting it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely caught my attention. It's like one of those things you see and think, wait, is this really happening? Seems like every few years this topic pops up and then fades away.
It does. But, you sent over this stack of articles and reports, and it's pretty clear that this time it feels a bit different. There's like a real sense of urgency, at least on the U.S. side. We've got to dig into this, figure out why it's back, and what it all means.
Exactly. It's not just a news blip. There are some serious geopolitical currents at play here. And for you, our listener, who brought this to our attention, we're going to break it all down. We'll go beyond the headlines, get into the nitty-gritty of the why behind this whole Greenland situation.
Absolutely. We're going to look at what's motivating the U.S., how Greenland and Denmark are pushing back, and, the historical context that feeds into this whole thing. Then we can maybe take a crack at figuring out where this might all be headed.
Ryan, it's really fascinating stuff. So let's just jump right in, shall we? The first big question, the elephant in the room, is why is the U.S. suddenly so keen on acquiring Greenland? What's the driving force?
Yeah, the sources you sent over point to a few key factors, but the one that keeps popping up is this idea of strategic security.
It's front and center, that's for sure. Both President Trump and Vice President Vance have been very vocal about it. Their argument basically boils down to this. Greenland is absolutely essential, they say, for both U.S. national security and global stability. And the main threat they're pointing to, well, it's the growing influence of China and Russia, especially in the Arctic region.
They're not mincing words, are they? I mean, we have President Trump on record saying flat out, we need Greenland. Very importantly, for international security, we have to have Greenland.
That's about as direct as it gets. And Vice President Vance, he's been right there with him, emphasizing that the U.S. has to gain control to stop the threat of China and Russia. It's a very clear message.
What strikes me is the language they're using. It's like President Trump even said something about Chinese and Russian ships all over the place in the Arctic. It paints a picture of this, almost like a creeping encroachment that they're really concerned about.
It definitely creates a sense of urgency, doesn't it? Yeah. And when you think about the changing dynamics in the Arctic, well, it makes sense. With climate change opening up new sea routes and access to resources, the region is becoming a lot more important, both militarily and commercially.
Right. It's like everyone's suddenly realizing that the Arctic is this new frontier, and whoever controls key locations there, like Greenland, will have a huge advantage.
Exactly. So you have this global power competition playing out, and the U.S. sees Greenland as a strategic linchpin in that struggle. But it's not just about external actors. They've also been pretty critical of how Denmark has been managing Greenland.
Oh, yeah. The sources are full of that. They really lay into Denmark, accusing them of basically neglecting Greenland and not investing enough in the territory.
Vice President Vance didn't hold back. He said, "Our message to Denmark is very simple. You have not done a good job by the people of Greenland. You have underinvested." I mean, that's pretty blunt.
It is. And he goes on to say that Greenland would be much better off, under the U.S. security umbrella. It's like they're saying, hey, we can take care of you better than they can.
And he even ties it to the U.S. military base in Greenland, saying that it's less secure because allies like Denmark aren't spending enough on defense. It's a pretty pointed critique, especially for a NATO ally.
It makes you wonder about the state of those alliances, right? Like, is this a sign of deeper tensions? But anyway, so security is obviously a big factor, but the sources also mention economic interests.
Right, they do. There's a lot of talk about Greenland's untapped mineral reserves and rare earths. In a world where those resources are so crucial, you can see why that would be tempting.
Absolutely. Those rare earths are in everything these days, from our phones to electric cars to military tech. Having access to those resources is like a huge geopolitical prize.
No doubt about it. And it seems like President Trump, well, he might have a more personal interest in this whole thing, too. There's a sense that he's really driven by this idea of expanding American territory and influence.
Yeah, that idea of territorial control, of adding Greenland to the American sphere of influence, it does feel very, like a throwback to a different era, almost like a land grab.
It's interesting because some analysts have even interpreted Vice President Vance's trip as a way for President Trump to, flex his muscles a bit and show that he's still interested in expanding American power. And Vance himself has said, we can't just ignore the president's desires.
That's telling, isn't it? It suggests that there's more to this than just cold, hard strategic calculations. And some of the sources even draw comparisons to presidents like McKinley and Polk, both known for their territorial ambitions. It's like they're saying that Trump sees this as a way to cement his legacy.
It's really fascinating how history keeps repeating itself. I mean, this isn't the first time the U.S. has considered buying Greenland, is it?
Nope, not at all. You know, good old William Seward, the same guy who bought Alaska for the U.S., he actually tried to buy Greenland, and Iceland for that matter, back in 1868.
Wow, really? I didn't know that. So the strategic importance of Greenland has been on the U.S. radar for a long time.
It has. And then after World War II, President Truman, he also wanted to acquire Greenland. He saw it as crucial during the Cold War, to counter the Soviet Union. So this current interest really fits into a pattern.
A pattern of the U.S. looking north and seeing Greenland as a strategic prize. But how have Greenland and Denmark responded to all this attention? Seems like they're not exactly rolling out the welcome mat.
No, not at all. They're pushing back pretty hard. I mean, look at what happened just before Vice President Vance's visit. Greenland formed this broad coalition government with 4 different parties coming together. It was a real show of unity.
It was a pretty powerful statement, wasn't it? Like they were saying, we're all in this together and we're not going to be bullied. And their coalition agreement makes their position very clear. Greenland belongs to us. They're asserting their right to self-determination, to choose their own destiny and their own partners.
And some of the key figures in Greenland have been very outspoken. Former Prime Minister EJ, he actually saw National Security Advisor Waltz's presence in the U.S. delegation as a demonstration of power, like the U.S. was trying to intimidate them.
It definitely gives you a sense of how they're feeling, like they're being pressured and treated like a pawn in a bigger game. And the new Prime Minister, Nielsen, he didn't mince words either. He called Vance's visit a shame, criticizing the timing and the way the U.S. was going about it. He felt like they weren't showing Greenland the respect it deserves.
And it's not just the politicians. The sources talk about public protests with people chanting, "Yankees, go home." It seems like there's a lot of popular opposition to becoming part of the U.S.
Yeah, the message from Greenland is loud and clear. We're not for sale. And Denmark has been right there with them, backing them up all the way.
Absolutely. Prime Minister Frederiksen of Denmark, she accused the U.S. of putting unacceptable pressure on both Greenland and Denmark, and she vowed to resist it.
It's a strong statement of support for Greenland's sovereignty. And even King Frederick of Denmark, he spoke out, expressing his love for Greenland and its people. It was a reminder of that deep connection between Denmark and Greenland.
And it seems like this whole episode has actually fueled Greenland's desire for more autonomy. The new coalition government has said they want to significantly increase Greenland's self-determination and create a roadmap for taking back more control over their own affairs.
It's interesting how external pressure can sometimes have that effect. Like, it pushes people to assert their independence even more strongly. The desire for greater autonomy was already there in Greenland, but the U.S. actions seem to have accelerated it.
Right. So we have this very clear U.S. interest and this equally clear rejection from Greenland and Denmark. And then we have Vice President Vance's visit, which, well, it didn't exactly go as planned.
No, it didn't. The delegation was pretty high level. You had Vice President Vance and his wife, National Security Advisor Waltz, Energy Secretary Wright, Senator Lee. But the visit itself was very limited.
They had to cancel visits to Nuuk and Sisimiut, and they basically stayed at the Pituffik space base the whole time. It sounds like the protests played a big role in that decision. Even Usha Vance had to cancel her cultural tour.
Yeah, it shows how much opposition there was and how seriously the U.S. administration was taking it. While he was at Pituffik, Vice President Vance did give a speech to U.S. troops, reiterating the U.S. policy on Greenland. He even said that Greenland would be a lot better coming under the United States security umbrella.
And he kept up the criticism of Denmark, saying they haven't invested enough in Greenland and suggesting that the U.S. would do a much better job. But the big question is, how does the U.S. think they can actually pull this off? I mean, Greenland and Denmark have made it pretty clear that they're not interested.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Interestingly, when Vice President Vance was asked about using military force, he was very clear. We do not think that military force is ever going to be necessary.
That's significant. And especially when you think back to what President Trump has said in the past, about maybe needing to do something to get Greenland.
Exactly. So it seems like they're ruling out force. But then Vance goes on to say that they expect to cut a deal, Donald Trump style. It sounds like they think they can negotiate their way into acquiring Greenland, maybe by offering economic incentives or something like that.
It's a big contrast to the idea of using force or coercion. So we have this tension between this vision of a negotiated deal and the reality that the U.S. sees this as a strategic imperative. It's almost like they're talking past each other.
Exactly. And that's where the uncertainty lies. What does a Trump-style deal even mean in this situation? It's pretty open to interpretation.
Well, looking at all these sources you sent over, it's clear this is a complicated story. It's not just a simple real estate deal, right? It's about geopolitics, historical baggage, national pride, the right to self-determination. What jumps out at you the most from all of this?
For me, it's the strength of the response from Greenland. That coalition government, their declaration that Greenland belongs to us, it really shows how determined they are to control their own future. And they're standing up to some serious pressure from a global superpower. It's quite impressive.
It really highlights the different perspectives at play here. The U.S. sees this as a strategic necessity, but Greenland and Denmark are focused on their sovereignty and their right to choose their own path. And it's not clear how those two views are going to be reconciled. This idea of a deal in the face of such strong resistance is a real puzzle.
It is, and it raises some big questions about the future of the Arctic. How are these relationships going to evolve? What's going to happen to the balance of power in the region?
Absolutely. And it makes you think, what if Greenland decides to go for full independence from Denmark? How would that change the whole game? What would it mean for the U.S., for the Arctic, for the world? It's something to keep an eye on for sure.